Amongst all the talk of rail projects in difficulty with cost overruns and delays and scaling back and so forth, there's one place where quietly they've just been getting on with it and they're about to deliver something truly remarkable. I've come to Taffs Well depot here in South Wales to meet with the team who are delivering the South Wales Metro and to chat with James Price, the Chief Executive Officer of Transport for Wales, about how this project's come about, where they are in terms of delivering it, and their very exciting plans for the future. Phil Bishop, the depot manager here at Taffs Well, gave us all a guided tour of the superb facilities. And then it was time to chat with James Price, CEO of Transport for Wales. James Price, thanks for joining Green Signals. Really appreciate you giving us some time today. We're here at Taffs Well depot, the sort of the beating operational heart, I guess, of South Wales Metro. It's clearly a genuinely transformational project. What's the background to it? Where was the genesis of it?
So the genesis of the Metro project probably can go back many decades if you went right the way back and looked at people saying, well, Southeast Wales actually could be way better connected than it is, and it could function as what we would describe now as a city region. But in recent years, it probably goes back kind of 10 or 12 years to a series of papers that were written, academic papers or quasi-academic papers, including quite a few by a guy called Mark Barry, who propositioned that by, in effect, making it very easy to get around Southeast Wales, you could create a city region, i.e. an economic conurbation that functioned way better than it has done in the past. And that's what the Metro's all about. And
is what we are seeing delivered today part of a stage to something else, or are we looking at something that's fairly comprehensive in its whole?
So I think what we're talking about today is both a stage towards something else, but also something that would function on its own as well. So what we've done is we've created the backbone of a light rail or a lighter rail system across the valleys lines in Southeast Wales that will allow people to get in and out of the capital city of Wales, Cardiff, much easier than they have been able to do, and it will be able to move many more people. But hot on the heels of that, even without any further rail investment, we've got things like bus franchising, which is shortly to be upon us, most likely first starting in 2027. And with that, we've already immediately got the opportunity to do things which interlink rail and bus at both ends of people's journey to allow for a much better door-to-door journey experience.
Well, it's fantastic. We'll probably talk a bit about multimodal integration in a little while. We'll talk about ticketing. But in terms of the South Wales Metro project, then, how far along are we in the timeline of being able to say to the passengers of the region, here you go?
So we're really very close now to being able to say phase one is delivered. In fact, I think I would stand here today and argue that phase one has been delivered, because we've got electrified lines with discontinuous electrification, with new signalling, with level boarding, running right across the Treherbert, Aberdare and Merthyr lines, and they're running just outside of here today with the class 756 Stadler units rather than the tram trains that are behind me, but that's running today. And over the next kind of 3 months, we'll see up to 14 units rolled out, ahead of later this year, the tram trains coming onto that part of the network. And then beyond that, what will be left is the Rumney side of the Valleys lines, which runs up through Caerphilly, to do the same treatment for that, basically.
Okay, so that's a future phase.
Yes.
Okay. But in terms of the actual project itself, I think originally budgeted to cost around 750 million. It has now gone a little over $1 billion, but I'm guessing that a lot of that is externalities that have impacted on the project. Is that fair?
So I think, to be fair, like almost all other rail projects, we've encountered things that people didn't expect to encounter. We've encountered, if you start at the very beginning, we took ownership of the Core Valleys lines, I think about 5 or 6 days into the COVID pandemic, literally.
Okay.
So we took ownership and we were having conversations around how we were going to build this thing, with people staying I can't remember now whether it was 1.5 meters or 3 meters apart, and how we were going to keep the project going. So that layered some cost on in the first instance. We also had things like we're working with Stadler, we're working with international companies around signalling. How did all of that work? I think that layered on a bit of cost. And then probably we didn't have quite enough optimism bias. But people worked really hard to keep the project going through COVID. We think we have achieved something of the order of 200 to 300 million pounds savings over what we would have done if we had done it conventionally with normal electrification. So I think the team can be proud of what they've achieved. And we will sit relatively well compared to other rail projects in terms of how much over budget we've gone. But obviously we're doing everything that we can do to try and keep the budget back down.
So you said a really interesting thing about sort of normal electrification. So when you look at this project from the outside, you've got discontinuous electrification. So some bits that are, some bits that aren't. We've got hybrid, we've got tri-mode, we've got batteries, obviously. It feels to the uninformed like quite a complex solution. Would it not have just been easier to electrify everything and just go for a simple solution?
So what we have, I think, is quite a complex solution. I think that's a fair thing to say. And an engineer that I respect really, really highly, who worked across a number of different UK rail, but also automotive projects right around the world, described some of what we're doing here as complex back in the day as some of the early Crossrail stuff.
Okay, wow.
Because of the high intensity use of quite new technology. So nothing we are using is being used for the first time, but using it all together over the length of journeys that we will be making, that's the first. The reason we are doing it is we went through a procurement process for people to design this, and they were allowed to design whatever they wanted, whether that be conventional heavy rail. Someone could have designed and pitched a light rail, full light rail solution. And the kind of hybrid approach that we had was the one that went out. And I think the main reason for that was that even though it's new, as I said, all the component parts have been used before. And secondly, because the way that the geography of the Valley's lines works and the topography, there's so many different interventions that you would have to make to lift bridges that would not only cost an awful lot of money to allow for the electrics to go underneath, but you'd also be disconnecting communities from each other and from their places of work for quite a long period of time. So we've probably ended up with really the only way of doing something in the times that we now live.
Yeah. Okay, no, that I hadn't thought about the community access points, obviously absolutely key. One of the things I did read though was somewhere when the first of the, I think it was the BIMO, the TRIMO, the 756 trains came into operational service, sort of passengers on the station were just like, oh, can we actually, is this for us sort of thing? I mean, that must make you feel really quite good in the sense that this is genuinely transformational from an experience point of view.
And it is.
Yeah.
And I guess in that we are helped by the fact that we had some of the oldest rolling stock that we are replacing. People have already forgotten the Pacers actually, but if you go back to the Arriva coloured Pacers that genuinely used to leak water on top of people, and quite often the smoke from the exhaust stacks used to belch back into the cabin, and compare that with what you see behind you or behind me, it is a completely different scenario. And that is why I wasn't there, but quite a few people reported it. That is why when the train stopped, people were saying, but this is not our train. This must be on test for someone else.
Yeah.
So that has helped us, but equally, this is the best you're going to get in UK light or lighter rail at the current time.
Yeah.
The job we've got to do is make it work really effectively.
Absolutely. I want to ask you just a question about sort of costs. The recent, I think the most recent ORR, Office of Rail and Road Digest on the cost of the industry, the rail sector, if you like, had Transport for Wales quite high up. I think it was something like 32 pence per passenger kilometre subsidy, which is pretty high. Is that a function of it being a primarily a lot of rural lines, or is it that lack of sustained investment over decades, or I suppose is it a political choice really?
So I think the honest answer is it's a combination of all of those things. And I imagine, but I'm not certain, that if you were to cut the data again, we wouldn't be quite so high up the league table as we were before, because we've seen a significant amount of passenger growth in this year alone. So I think about 11% passenger growth in the last 12 months we have seen, which compares very favourably with most other operators. However, we have just invested a lot of money. A lot of the rolling stock is on lease. We haven't capital purchased it. Therefore, the cost of the rolling stock, which might be sunk elsewhere, is in those figures as well.
Fair.
And we've inherited a very low fare structure. If you look at our fares per mile compared to most other parts of the UK, they're quite low. Right. But of course, that's a socio and political choice as well.
Yeah.
So our challenge as an operator is to minimise the subsidy. The way that we're doing that is by trying to maximise the number of people that travel with us, and that seems to be working really well. We're also trying to maximise the yield everywhere we can, but in a way that is socially acceptable to the people who fund us, which is the general public, our customer base, and the government. But as you can well imagine, there are certain market segments where we can charge more for a higher quality product. So we offer a first class service to Manchester and to North Wales, for example. That's a good revenue earner for us, and we need to make sure that we make good money where we can, and we cross subsidise in a sensible way that makes sense for the government policy of the day.
Okay. One of the things I thought you would have done is because the Core Valley lines is quite distinct. It's sort of quite separate. So when systems like Manchester Metro Link or probably Tyne and Wear Metro, even before that, they certainly Manchester, they went down a very light rail solution, and that enabled all sorts of things. It enabled them to have driver-only operation. It enabled them to have things like line of sight signalling, which can have some capacity benefits. Now, you've not done that. Is that something that's an option for the future? Because that could help drive down that subsidy as you described.
So I think the first thing I'd say is we need to operate within the socio and political environment that we find ourselves in. And there is a strong view from the government of the day that they would not want to go driver-only operation, and that they value quite strongly the role of the guard, both as a second person on the train from a security perspective, but also some of the safety critical roles that a guard can provide.
Yeah.
And that is why that we have reached the conclusion that for all of our rolling stock, when it's operating under heavy rail conditions, and that's the important caveat, will retain a guard upon it. When we're looking at things like tram extensions that are additional to and or different from the main network, I think that is the first place that we might see us doing something slightly differently. But again, I would stress only with agreement from the government of the day and working in partnership with trade unions. But in theory, there are lots of different things that could be done in the future, yes.
Yeah, okay, no, I get that, absolutely. I suppose another macro question, if you like, because Wales is a little different. If you sort of go back into time, sort of 2004, 2005, when the last Railways Act was under development, here we are again looking at a new one. Wales took a different route to the one that Scotland did, for instance. I'm sure that was for good reason, but it's meant you've ended up being responsible for the operating of the train services. You don't have control over the infrastructure. That's still done by Network Rail.
Correct.
I almost want to ask good decision, bad decision. I suppose it is what it is, but has it caused issues, and how do you resolve those?
So I guess there's probably two broad answers to that. The first is we'll start with the Core Valleys lines where we are today. So with the Core Valleys lines, through a different mechanism, we do have responsibility for both the track and the train.
Right.
And as we move towards the future, hopefully on the back of legislation that's going to be passed around GBR, we will be able to integrate that even further, because we'll move away from the European regulations that kind of still force some separation in the way that the two are operated. If we think about the wider network, I think there are a series of good reasons why Wales didn't take it in the past, which was mainly around a concern that the funding wouldn't follow. So you'd have the asset, you'd have the liability, but you wouldn't have the funding to deal with that. As we move forward, I think what we need to do is find a way that works effectively with GBR, such that we can, wherever possible, try and put track and train back together. So we work very closely together with the Wales route of Network Rail currently to try and do that. We've got quite a few examples of local railways in existence now where we've created one P&L at a local level, and we've got a manager that might be Network Rail or TfW managing an integrated team.
Yeah.
We are literally in live conversations with both the Network Rail and the GBR team about how we can do something that emulates that on a grander scale for the balance of the railway in Wales that isn't CVL for the future.
Got it right, because one of the people we've spoken to a number of times on green signals is Nick Millington, of course, who's the route director to Wales Borders, and he only ever talks about partnership and collaboration and working together. So that's...
And Nick would be a key person that we're talking to as part of that, and that is to be fair, that is what we experience when we're working with Nick.
All right, well, that's really good to hear. It does take us onto the sort of whole question of funding, because I look at this project and I think almost like it's brilliant you've been able to do it at all, because actually it was quite a complex funding package. I know you had to put, the Welsh government had to put a chunk of money in, but because rail is not devolved, that had to come out of your ordinary block grant. And I look at big schemes now in the Department of Transport. A lot of the budget is being consumed by projects which are actually England and Wales, not England only. And we may well do a separate podcast on the Barnet Forum and all the rest of it. But for now, clearly the Barnet arrangements mean, because they're England and Wales, you get a lower proportion than say Scotland does, right?
Yeah.
I'm not asking about that particularly, but if you could wave your magic wand and change, I suppose, one institutional framework issue, would it be that one? Would that enable more capital to come in?
Clearly that would be massively helpful to us, yes. Now, whether that's going to happen or not, I can't say. What I can say, and it's a matter of record, is that the First Minister of Wales, in a collaborative fashion, because it's the same party in government in Whitehall now, is putting quite a bit of pressure on to see something of a fair settlement around HS2. And I guess that's the one that really stands out currently, that is called an England Wales project, but it's quite difficult to see the benefit to Wales at the minute, and we don't have any funding for it.
Certainly, if it's phase one only, yeah.
So that would clearly significantly help things here. I think in terms of funding of this project, the other thing to remember is this is not really a transport project anyway, the Valleys Lines part. This is about creating an economy that can function, getting people out of poverty, getting people a healthier lifestyle, etc., etc. And that was the premise of the metro. Those things are devolved, but you're quite right. From a transport project perspective, the existing system does not help us.
That's a very, very fair answer. Now, I just want to move on to something that's really positive. I mean, all of that we've talked about is positive, but this is really positive. You've actually, whilst the rest of England is talking about, we must try and implement pay-as-you-go ticketing outside of London, you've actually done it.
We have, yeah.
And so that's now live, I believe, on the whole of the core. So that's 95 stations, and you can tap in, tap out, just as you can in
London. Yes.
Yeah. How's that been received by passengers?
So the take-up is very high.
Right.
What we haven't done yet is significantly marketed it, in the same way that we haven't really significantly marketed a lot of the interventions that we've had until this year, because we wanted to make sure we had a product that worked and a product that people can experience and then want to buy it again, rather than when they come along and say, well, that wasn't very good, I don't want it anymore. So our experience of tap in, tap out is that it has been quite a complex project, but actually it's not been as complex to deliver as many other things that we've done. The team have done a really good job. We've partnered with Visa to help us with it. They've been able to learn lessons from elsewhere. And the big thing that we've got to make sure is, number one, we market it, and we expect it to be the main way that people pay for things. And number two, that people can trust the system in terms of the cap on, tap tap outs, for example, and what happens if a validator isn't working, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's other things that we want to be able to look at adding on. So at the minute, you cannot have a rail card and use tap in, tap out.
Right.
There's a whole series of very good reasons for that. But how amazing would it be if people with a rail card could also experience a discount through tap in, tap out?
Because that was preloaded and the
right,
system knew.
yes.
Right, okay.
So that's the next thing that we're looking at.
One of the recurring themes I find here is that this very sensible approach of make sure it works before you oversell it, really. And that's, I can see that with the metro and see that with the ticketing as well. But I looked at the pay-as-you-go caps on weeklies. I mean, I don't think anybody will use anything else once, it's
so once people see it, I think you're absolutely right. That is what they would use.
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing when we speak to people around us.
I did notice one funny little anomaly. You can use it on cross-country trains in the South Wales area, but not on Great Western. I mean, is that a technology issue or
So
what?
it's not really a technology issue. I think this is an issue around how effectively we can persuade other operators to accept our ticketing. There is a small technological issue, I believe, in that GWR currently do not carry the validators necessary to test the bank card. But I'm sure we'll get through all of that, in the next 12 months.
Right. Maybe GBR will help that. And can we see pay as you go rolled out across the rest of Wales?
So I would like to see it rolled out across the rest of Wales, yes. I would also like to see that linked properly in with other modes of transport, particularly bus. So our motto being one network, one timetable, one ticket. If that's going to happen, pay as you go will be a key component part of that, and we need to make that workable across the different modes. We're doing quite a bit of work on exactly how that would operate.
Yeah.
And there's different paradigms in which that could operate, but and we will achieve it, but we just haven't done that yet.
Yeah. Let's just move on and talk about the future. Let's start with South Wales Metro. So we've got these tram trains, and one of the reasons, the logic behind that was because obviously it can go off network, it can go on to a light rail network, whether that's segregated or street running. Now, my understanding is the first bit of that is going to happen. Just talk through a bit what the plan is for that, and also where these vehicles could enable you to go in the future.
So to all intents and purposes, you're quite right. The first phase of on-street running has been agreed, and that's a project that runs from Cardiff Central to the top end of the Bay line that goes down to Cardiff Bay.
Right.
That's a relatively short section. I think it's about 800 metres, but it will allow for connectivity from services that currently don't have connectivity towards Cardiff Bay. Cardiff Council have got significant development plans for Cardiff Bay, which will see much more leisure activity down there. And therefore, you will be able to have connectivity from things like the stadium, big stadium in Cardiff city centre, to new big leisure facilities in Cardiff Bay. So that will be the first use of them. And that will see on-street running as well as segregated light rail running. And the project is in design for that as we speak, working obviously really closely with Cardiff Council, who will run the highway on which some of the network will operate on.
And presumably no catenary because you can use the batteries.
That's right. But for the short section I talked about, it's catenary free.
It is, okay.
We do have catenary on the Bay line currently, but they could easily come off at the other end for a further extension without catenary.
Got it, okay. So that's, and then the longer term future, obviously looking at more extensions.
Anywhere anyone wants, really. Now there's a long list.
Got people really excited now.
There's a long list of what people would like to do. As you will be aware, the challenge with anything like this is to get political consensus, funding, make sure there's a business case, and then have it delivered. But the good thing about what we've got here is that this depot itself is capable of storing and maintaining twice the number of units that we have. So there's plenty of room for expansion. Probably without stabling, we could do 3 times the number of units that we have. So, that is many decades of expansion availability there. Yeah. And the radius that these units can run on is really very tight.
I saw the entry curve in like 25 metres or something. It's extraordinary.
They're capable of they can go a lot of places.
Yeah. One other question about the future for the metro. I know, it's fantastic, 4 trains per hour over most of the of the Valley lines, but the Corriton branch, which is kind of within Cardiff really, and also I think the City line, which goes through Ninian Park, and another key corridor, they're restricted to 2 trains an hour. Which, I suppose, if you're thinking about a real metro, the aspiration's got to be to get those
Agreed.
up to,
And I think that's why it's always described as a multi-phase project. And I guess this is not a cop-out. I'd come back to the kind of socio-political environment and consensus. So I think that once this is up and running, there will be most likely a stronger clamour for those services to be run. The good thing is that for a very small marginal cost, those services can be run.
Right.
Because we're talking about a small number of million per unit here. And we wouldn't need to do a lot of infrastructure work at all, if that makes sense.
No, it does.
But that probably couldn't, none of that could be done without the signalling centre, without the depot, et cetera, et cetera.
Which you've got, right.
Yeah, I think the point that initially this was about creating that connected city region, and particularly focusing on more outlying areas to give them the opportunity of being closely connected to a city. That's what it started with, but that's not the end of it.
Got it. Let's just talk briefly then, as we kind of come to a close, about the future for, I suppose, rail and transport in Wales, because of course you are Transport for Wales, not just rail for Wales. I'm presuming that in terms of longer term priorities, things like South West Main Line, capacity and electrification, North West Wales Line, North Wales Main Line, sorry, they're the big priorities, or are they? Or are there other things that you're focused on?
I think what you will see in terms of priorities at the minute, certainly, and I can't see it massively changing, is South Wales Main Line, which is both an electrification ask, but also a capacity ask between Cardiff and as you go towards Bristol. And there are projects that are being worked up around that, utilising the relief lines to do that. And then North Wales Main Line, capacity and electrification. Wrexham Bidston, to try and connect North East Wales into the Mersey city region, would be another one. And then outside of that, and we've been quite careful to allow for this to continue to happen, in the kind of city deal world, where you've seen regions or groups of local authorities doing individual deals with government, I think that's where you would see further expansions of the metro being funded from. So from a rail perspective, those would be the priorities. And
it's just suddenly come across my mind, it's probably a slightly sort of cheeky question, really. I know rail reopenings get everybody terribly excited. I know one of the projects that's often talked about is Carmarthen, Aberystwyth up to Carnarvon and Bangor. I'm not drawing you on that because I know that's probably quite sensitive. But do you think there's a future where we could see Wales Railway get bigger as well as better?
So if we can demonstrate that we can bring the subsidy per person down, if we can demonstrate that the public really like what we're doing, then I think that would typically follow. What I would want to be trying to do is to use, I don't know whether it's new technologies, but different technologies more effectively to bring the cost of some of those down. So if we're talking about relatively low speed lines in relatively rural areas, possibly what we've done in the past in terms of applying 100 mile per hour into city standards before we reopen something is probably not the way to go. So we need to find a new way to do those type of things. But if we can do that, and what we've tried to do with the Valleys lines is a good example of that, I see no reason why not.
That could be quite exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've got one final question actually on something that you do, which many people probably feel is a bit left field. You actually have probably one of the best restaurant services, catering services on any railway, which is the Marches line from Cardiff, Manchester. How's that going? Is it doing well? Is it something, could we see more of that in the future?
So it's going really well. I think because people recognise the quality of the product. In all honesty, we've had quite a few difficulties at the beginning with this. So Mark IV units with Class 67s is not a natural fit, as you all know. There's a lot of history to that. When we picked up most of the units, they've been sat around not doing anything for a long period of time. The way they're maintained is very difficult because different parts of them are maintained in different parts of the UK. And if any of that as a system gets broken, it takes a long time to get the system back up and running. Having said that, the team have worked really, really well, and they took, outside of storms anyway, they have taken the reliability in terms of emptying from a place which was the worst in the fleet to the best in the fleet by far, the Mark IV rakes. So that's really good, first thing. Second thing, the quality of the product is really good. And we've spent quite a lot of time focusing on it as a draw to get more people on those north-south services, because it's one of the things that does allow us to offset subsidy in other parts of the network. So food doesn't make us money, but we believe food is a draw to bring people onto the network, which does make us money to allow us to cross-subsidise elsewhere. And it's gone really well over the last 12 months. I think we've almost doubled the amount of business that we're doing through it, and we expect that to continue.
Brilliant. Well, look, my very, very final question, James. You've been CEO for 6 years. Sounds like you're enjoying the job.
Yeah, I am.
But have you, if you sort of look back at 6 years ago and thought, right, where are we going to be in 2024? Do you feel, this now is sort of culmination of something, or is there more to, how do you sort of measure I suppose the journey really that Transport for Wales and you've been on?
So I think as a result of COVID, we were knocked back by a couple of the years.
Sure.
Same as the rest of the world is,
Yes,
frankly.
absolutely, yeah.
And therefore, we might have expected to get where we are today 2 years earlier than we were. I think we need to build people's confidence in what we've built. So we've seen some really good figures in the last 12 months for TfW Rail as a whole in terms of reliability, lack of cancellations, yield, passenger numbers. But that 12 months does not, that's not very much to build anything on. I think people, particularly in government, need to see that that's real, that we can continue to do that. And then on the back of that, we'll build out on the bus network, which will be really exciting and really important.
Well, look, I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation and really enjoyed the visit. I mean, what a terrific facility. The attention to detail here is superb.
It's really
and these new tram trains are just magnificent. So I'm sure they will have that transformative effect. But thank you very much for your time. Congratulations on what's been delivered so far, and good luck for the future.
And thank you. Cheers.